All right. So thank you so much, Simon. I think we are happy to start, and we are recording this a wonderful panel discussion for our friends who will be joining us. Some of you are still joining us from other parts of the world, and I take this opportunity to welcome you all here at the Australia India Institute for our wonderful International Women's Day event. I, on behalf of the director, Professor Ashok, and my lovely team and colleagues here at the Australia India Institute, welcome you all, our lovely audience, and especially to our panelists, giving us this time today on the 8th of March to share their experiences with us on a very challenging year that we have just witnessed, 2020. We are entering 2021, equally a challenging year as we look for healing, as we look for a collective wisdom, thinking about a shared future. Before I start the program, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous people of the land and pay my respect on behalf of the Australia India Institute. All of us, my colleagues, myself, including the director, and all the panelists, including the audience, we acknowledge that we are on the lands of the people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and acknowledge and introduce the panelists to you all. We have our lovely Indra Lyshram, we have Dr. Karen Mathias, we have Chon, Raman, and our amazing dynamite feminists, and my dear colleague, also from the Australia India Institute, Dilpreet, Taggar. I will do the honors and read out their amazing profile so that we can learn about their wonderful lives and what they have done so far. Indra Lyshram is a media professional with more than 20 years of experience writing and editing. Indra Lyshram began her career with the Press Trust of India. She went on to work for the Times of India and Business World magazine before migrating to Australia in 2009, where she started working with Indian community magazines. Currently, Indira writes for the India Sun and brings out a newsletter every Monday called Community Insider. She is also a recipient of the prestigious Judith Nelson Grant for Community Journalism. Our second wonderful speaker for our Women's Day panel at the AII is Dr. Karen Mathias. Welcome, Dr. Karen. Karen was born in Tamil Nadu in India and is a public health physician and mother of 4 beautiful children. She has been working in Uttarakhand, North India for the past 12 years in the broad areas of community mental health as a researcher and activist, focusing on women's mental health among low-income communities. She is the director and founder of the partnership initiative Burans. Her work among women in slums and research has examined the asymmetries experienced by women in North India related to their mental distress and caregiving for family members and mental illness. In her study among women and mental health problems and disability in India, she found many ways that women have thrived and cared for themselves and others through the stress of COVID during the COVID lockdown, which gives hope and direction to women thriving through and beyond COVID-19. We have our third panelist, our wonderful Chon Raman. And this is her lovely biography. Chon is originally from Nagaland in Northeast India and has lived and worked in Australia, largely in the corporate world for close to 17 years. She currently works for a global company called SAP, a global leader in enterprise application software, and currently heads the customer engagement business for SAP procurement in the Asia Pacific region. She works with customers across multi-countries and industries in the diverse region of Asia Pacific. She is here to share her journey of growing up, studying and working in India and in Australia as well. And our final speaker for the panel will be our own AII star, Dilpreet Taggar. Dilpreet was born and raised in different parts of India, and she's a Punjabi at heart and a very staunch feminist. Her work involves around racial, gender, and political affairs. In 2020, Dilpreet founded South Asian Today, and that you can visit that online, www.southasiantoday.com.au. It is Australia's first media organization for South Asian women and non-binary peoples to ensure South Asians remain in charge of their narratives and lead the conversation around their identity, lived experiences, and politics. So as you can see, we have an amazing, I think, time ahead of us in the next, let's say, 50 minutes or so to get into their stories and have a wonderful conversation with the panelists. And I would request our audience to actually put their questions on the chat box, and Simon and I'll be moderating that. If I may, as the moderator for the AII panel on International Women's Day, take a minute or so. The panel theme that we have for the AII is from the United Nations Women's theme for International Women's Day 2021. It is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. And this theme is around celebrating the tremendous efforts of women and girls from around the world who are playing an important part in shaping a more equal future and also looking ahead and working pandemic. These are very, very challenging times. And as I read this mouthful of phrase that's here in terms of the United Nations Women theme, Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. It is quite daunting, actually, to think about this theme and to have a conversation in terms of leadership, in terms of success. The panelists that we have for AII today have been very successful in their own ways as community leaders, as grassroots activists, as healthcare providers, as journalists. And yet we are actually looking at very, very challenging times since the pandemic started last year in 2020. And if we talk about challenges, we're looking at how during this time we have pre-existing hierarchies and authorities that have been perpetuated and reproduced in many, many ways. That means women and a lot of girls around the world, both in global north and south, have been reduced to caregiving responsibilities. We have also seen an increase in gender-based violence. We have seen an increase in how girls and women have been actually primary care giving partners both at home and also in the workplace. As we talk about women in leadership in this AII panel, I would really like to also emphasize the most vulnerable communities across the world. And here in Australia, the indigenous communities, and also in India, Adivasis, Dalits, and tribals who have been actually at the margins of society and have had to undergo tremendous challenges during the time of COVID. And as we talk about Australia and India and the relations around leadership and women, I take this as the moderator, the time to take cognizance of the protests also that we have witnessed in 2019 and 20 against the Citizenship Amendment Bill in India, and more recently noticing the farmers' protests where women have come out in large numbers to support social movements. And having said these few words, I would really like to invite our first panelists to take around 5 to 7 minutes to come on board and share her experiences. Indra Lyshram, the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Dolly. Thank you so much to the Australia-India Institute for having me as one of the panelists today. I guess I'll just start with a bit about my journey as a journalist. So, and I'm sorry, I've got some notes here because I'm not a very good impromptu speaker. I was born and brought up in the northeast of India, and when I expressed my desire to become a journalist, obviously friends and family there had a very stereotypical what do you call image of journalist, and they thought it was about like people chasing celebrities for stories. But then when I started working for a magazine in college, it was called the Eastern Panorama. I was given an opportunity to interview the chief minister. For an 18-year-old then, it was a phenomenal experience for me. And I realized that I also liked the idea of sharing stories. So that for me was how my association with journalism began. I decided this is what I wanted to do. And and when people talked about journalism as being as only chasing celebrities, I spoke about how it is not that, and how it has a wider sector of opportunities. So along the way, when I started interviewing or getting stories on, say, rescued children of Nepal who were all set to be sold in brothels in India, I took this as turning point in my writing careers, because I thought this creates a sort of culture where we are able to hold people accountable. And for me, that is sort of an important piece of change. So as a journalist working in the Indian Sun, now in Australia, after 17 years of work in the media in Delhi, I was very fortunate enough, firstly, last year to get the Judith Nielsen grant for writing on communities stories during the pandemic. And I thought, the magazine is so vital to the community in a way, because it is increasingly rare these days as local news outlets everywhere withering. And now what I did with this grant is that I worked on stories that covered migrants talking about pain and resilience, separation and solidarity, and so on. So I was able to cover a whole section of people. For instance, I wrote about doctors Kishore Singh and Sudeshna Barman, who are in Shepparton now in the front line of things. And they saw changes and challenges as part of their profession. And their story reminded me of the great work that doctors do. I also did stories. I mean, I've covered, restaurateurs who shared their perspective on how the pandemic changed their businesses and how they were planning to adapt and evolve. And also there were stories about people, particularly students, who were struggling to get by with their basic necessities. And the community responded, they came out and helped. And I celebrated this moral leadership of community members in the stories that I do. And I find that in a small community, reporting on the pandemic becomes very personal, because this is all about storytelling and powerful storytelling, I feel. So the internet also gives us this huge benefit, in the sense that we reached a very large audience that we were not able to reach previously, and that we can distribute our journalism all over. And during the pandemic, everything was pivoted online. So this was really a good opportunity for us. To achieve an equal future in a post-COVID world, from the journalism point of view, or as a journalist, I would say that it's really important that we listen very closely to hear what people have to say and treat it seriously, because sometimes people without power have the most powerful things to say. And that's all I have to say for today. Yeah? Is that okay? Is that less than 5 minutes?
Thank you. You did very well. Yes, as a true journalist, you edited yourself so well that we have 3 minutes extra. So Dr. Kaaren, the time is yours, Dr. Kaaren.
All right. Okay. I thought that was pretty long.
Hi, namaste sabko, and good afternoon. I have a presentation, so I'm wondering if that could be shared. Okay, that's great. So it could maybe go onto the slideshow, yeah. So I'm wanting to share about the ways that women are participating in leadership in disadvantaged communities in North India, and presenting particularly from a perspective of the leadership that we don't always see in the media and social media, women who are not literate, but who are resilient and who have taken the space and the turbulence of COVID to expand their opportunity to influence and bring a more equal world in. Next slide. And I'm talking particularly from my experience based the last 12 years living in Uttarakhand. I don't look Indian, but I feel like I am an Indian at heart. I was born in India and I've spent more than 25 years living in India. And so I think it's also interesting for us to think about how Indian looks different. Increasingly, there's different ways we find our identity. And my husband and kids are from India, and that's a very core part of who I am. But I am also acknowledging that I'm at the moment based in New Zealand, and I left India last year during the COVID lockdown. And so I have a team in Uttarakhand, and we talk on WhatsApp for hours every week. And that's what I'm building this presentation on. So Uttarakhand, like most of North India, and in fact all of India, is a grossly unequal place for women, and women are disadvantaged in many spheres of life. And there's two things in our state that you can see. There's around 100 girls missing due to sex-selective terminations, and there's around 11 points difference in literacy, which shows a really sort of solid structural inequality to access to education, access to opportunities. And I guess that's why it's really important to celebrate where women can show leadership. We'll go to the next slide. And I think that it's important to think about, we've had some really important discussions happening at an international basis. I found it really interesting to see that countries led by women have systematically done a better job at controlling COVID and reducing the negative impacts for populations. And we've had people like the head of Taiwan and Angela Merkel in Germany, and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and the Chief Minister and others in Kerala, who have shown that women are compassionate and honest and seem to do a good job at leadership. But this focus that I want to share is around these 4 ways that women have shown leadership in high-need communities. And I'll be discussing each of these in a little more detail. Next slide. And so in particular, I'm focusing on some study and research that I've been doing, looking at assets in communities, particularly the assets that women offer through often very sort of prescribed gender roles, where women are often doing the majority of the housework, the majority of raising children, the majority of social work in communities. And even with the constraints of a very heavy workload, are able to expand their influence and improve things. And I'm speaking from the organization that I've been leading, Burans, which means rhododendron flower. And it's an organization focusing particularly on resilience and mental health. Next slide. We've done a couple of studies published last year, one which was looking at the needs and assets of community health systems in the Yamuna Valley, which we're looking at the very top end of the valley before it hits the plains and becomes a rather polluted river. And also a study that we did looking at how people cope and what were the impacts of mental distress during the lockdown. And yeah, our team has continued working right through, and so I wanted to profile 4 of the things that we noticed. Next slide. So one of the biggest things that we've noticed is that during the lockdown and subsequently, there's been really active leadership by women recognizing others who need help. And so this example, quote I've given here was a woman who was a widow who had a child with a disability, and she was illiterate. So she had a lot of things against her already. And then she has this, she says, oh, there's a woman who lives far away. She's older and she's alone, and we keep sending her rations. She's like our grandmother, and we want to look after her. And I think there's just been this amazing ability to show compassion where women support other women to kind of strengthen the community. And I think that's been really important and really needs to be celebrated. So that's one important way that women have shown leadership and support to each other. We'll go to the next slide. Another really important thing is how women have built and strengthened community well-being. And this is the woman in the picture here, Preeti, where the bag is one of our community workers. So most of our community workers have finished 12th class, and she is out talking to and sharing information about how to look after yourself, how to manage. But the woman that she talked to was amazing. She explained that they were actually really struggling. This was during the tail end of the lockdown in May last year. She said, oh, we actually run out of chai pati, but I'm still ordering the newspaper. And we were like, what? Why are you ordering the newspaper? And this woman said, well, in it, I find something hopeful every day that gives me knowledge or skills to cope with the lockdown. And then I share it with all my neighbors. And so she's kind of like being an agent of hope and well-being in her community. And she said, oh, my teenagers have had enough, but still I'm doing it. Next slide. And then we've had these amazing stories of young women taking action. And so on in the left of this slide here, we had a whole lot of young women in Basti and Dehradun who got together and said, let's take action. And somehow in the turbulence of the COVID lockdown, they saw an opportunity to increase their influence. They also did protests through their whole living area to really encourage others to engage in community care and making a cleaner place. And then there was this amazing story of a young Muslim woman along with a young Hindu woman. Both of them were 19, who knocked around all the neighbors, collected some rations, and then started this cooking endeavor. And they were using the local Gurdwara. And it was just, for me, super inspiring that young women could take this initiative, and they provided over 300 meals. Now, I realize I'm running out of time, so we'll quickly go to the next slide. And that was looking at the leadership provided by women with disabilities. And we've made it a big sort of program policy to have women with disabilities advising us. And this is a woman whose husband was a wheelchair user. And she described, she said, the fact that we got through my husband's back injury and we lost all that income and we're really struggling now, but because of that, we know that we will get through this pandemic, and this isn't something we're going through alone. Others are going through the same thing. And we've had so many instances of women with disabilities who have that sort of earned strength, which has made them strong as leaders and able to speak up in communities. We'll just go to the last slide here. Maybe that was the last one. So I think that the sort of take-home message from us is that it's been a rough year, but there have been women showing agency, showing resistance, and taking leadership in any ways that they can. And I hope it's a groundswell of shifting the power balance. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. I think we will call upon our third speaker. Yeah, Chon, it's your turn.
Yeah, thanks, Dolly. What a tough act to follow. Thank you, Karen, for everything that you do, and such inspiring stories. Thank you for sharing them with us. I need to start off with a very happy International Women's Day to everyone, and good afternoon and good morning to all of the folks from India that's dialed in too. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you to Dolly and the Australia-India Institute for having me here. I was given a very simple brief by Dolly for this discussion, and that was simply to tell my story. It's perhaps the simplest brief I've ever received for any speaking assignments, but also a little daunting because, like a lot of people, I tend to undervalue my story and also take my experiences for granted. But as I was almost forced to reflect on my journey over the weekend, what was very eye-opening for me is the existence of real and often deep-rooted challenges and inequality that still exists today. Dolly very eloquently touched on that in the introduction as well today. So let me tell my story. But to tell my story, I have to start a couple of generations back. So please bear with me. Like most societies, I come from a very patriarchal culture. My grandmother, who loved going to school, who loved learning, was told one day that she could no longer go to school as she needed to help her mother with the household chores. Her brothers, however, continued their education. So, when her fifth child, a daughter, was born after 4 sons, she made my grandfather promise that if they ever had to choose between educating their sons or their daughter, they would educate their daughter, because the boys already had a leg up simply by virtue of being born male. Women, for example, are not entitled to property or inheritance in the Naga culture. So, I was very fortunate to have a very far-sighted grandmother and a grandfather who supported her. I was also very fortunate to be raised by a working mother who had an equal role to play in the financial stability of my family. I'm the oldest in the family and my grandparents' first grandchild. So from a very early age, my entire family had, extremely high ambitions for me. So as a result, I grew up thinking that a girl could do anything a boy could. At one point, I think my family wanted me to be a surgeon, a missionary, and a concert pianist all at once. And in my free time, very casually aced the Indian Administrative Service exam. But spoiler alert, none of that happened. What I did have, though, was a very strong support system. There were certainly gender discrepancies all around me, but I just couldn't see it then. My mother, for example, would work just as hard as my dad in the family business, but after closing shop, would do all of the housework and caring for the children on her own. Armed with the self-belief that I had for my family, I decided to pursue a degree in mechanical engineering at the Bangalore Institute of Technology in Bangalore. I knew there wouldn't be too many girls in engineering, but what I was anticipating was to be the only girl in a year of 120 boys. This was in South India in the late 90s, early 2000s, and no one would sit with me for weeks voluntarily for fear of being teased or being laughed at. And I think I survived purely because of, just youthful obliviousness and again, the belief instilled in me that I could do anything that the boys could. And I almost forced myself to belong. Following the 4 years of engineering, I decided to find work in the industry, in the mechanical engineering industry space. And again, in my first job, I was the only girl with the exception of the lady running the reception, right? So it was becoming a bit of a trend. And so I decided that I need a little bit of diversity in my life, that, I wasn't quite enjoying standing out. What I didn't know, though, looking back, was that I was actually looking for a sense of belonging. And I think this is a very important point to note, as this is why so many girls, don't get into STEM degrees. And when they do graduate and they do get into STEM degrees and graduate, they don't stay very long. And as I looked for data over the weekend, there are actually tons of data that support this. And my story, unfortunately, is not very unique, even in the world today, right? So in search of more diversity and to broaden my skill set, I came to Australia to do my master's in engineering management and business from the University of Technology in Sydney. As Dolly mentioned earlier, I work for a company called SAP, and I've been here for the last 11 years. And I'm very happy to report that at SAP, 34% of the workforce is made up of women. So personally, it's been a big jump for me from being in the 0.00 something percentile to being in the 30s now. And while we still have a ways to go to achieve gender parity at SAP, we are ahead of industry standards, and we aim to achieve gender parity by 2030, which is just fantastic. COVID-19 has certainly changed the way we work, and it's certainly changed our priorities as an organization. And I'm seeing that with the companies that I interact with and executives that I interact with on a daily basis as well. It's also brought a lot of things to the fore. We touched on this already or earlier on in the discussion, that the impact of COVID has been quite disproportionate. The pandemic has been harder on women for a number of reasons. So for example, women take on the majority of unpaid care work, and obviously that takes a toll on women. And also women tend to be majority workers in industries most hit by the pandemic, like the hospitality industry, right? So the phrase, the common phrase that we're hearing a lot now, that we're all in the storm together, but we're not in the same boat, I think holds very true. Anecdotally speaking, I'm certainly seeing my female colleagues and my friends reverting to a lot more to the traditional gender roles that we've been speaking about. And all of this really brings to the fore urgent needs for, progressive policies and in places like India, really basic infrastructure to alleviate this gender gap, right? So we could talk about these things for a lot longer, but if I were to summarize, I'd like to put across three things towards having a more equal future, keeping to the theme of our discussion today. And the first is around the importance of creating a sense of belonging for our girls, for our women, and frankly, any other marginalized group. A sense of belonging in our schools, our universities, at our workplaces. So girls and women not only survive, but really thrive in these environments. And really the importance of having a good support structure, starting from home to all walks of life. Without the support structure that I had from my family, I don't think I would have been able to, or it would have been really difficult for me to face some of the challenges that I did. And finally, the need to change our existing institutional, societal norms at all levels, from the grassroots level to the highest policy making levels. Had my grandparents not felt passionately about the importance of education and acted on their beliefs ahead of their time, I think my life right now would have been very, very different. So I guess that's it for me for now. And thank you very much for allowing me to share my story.
Wow, Chon, that was quite an act. And after Dr. Karen, you going, and then we have Dilpreet. I'm just in awe of you all. So yeah, let me not waste my time. Dilpreet, come on board. It's your turn.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing, Chon. That was wonderful. And congratulations on a great journey that you've had. Hi, everyone. My name is Dilpreet. My story revolves around telling stories online and how they can create impactful change. So, as Dolly has already mentioned, I'm the founder of Australia's first media organization for South Asian women and non-binary peoples. It's called South Asian Today. I launched it in April 2020 when we were under peak COVID lockdown. I genuinely did think that it was going to fail, it was going to crash, or it won't even see the light of the day to begin with, because as an international student and as a migrant, being on the receiving end of a massive amount of lack of support from the government or authorities or employers does not make you believe that you can fight for an equal future, given you're yourself struggling, right? And the media industry in Australia is already quite uneven. Only 24% of people heard or seen on TV are women. And it's also a huge racial issue because almost 76% of people on Australian screens have an Anglo-Celtic background. So especially when we look at a situation like COVID, we're also looking at tons of women writers and artists who are aspiring journalists or want a place in the media, and they're left without opportunities. There are no media spaces or attention, especially for South Asian women and non-binary peoples in Australia. And that's precisely what I wanted to change with South Asian Today. So to be a woman leader and to achieve an equal future in COVID is a terrifying reality, because one person or one situation cannot anyway create an equal future, and it has to be an ongoing process. And I also think it's not upon women alone to create these spaces. So how South Asian Today is trying to fill a gap is by being a platform for South Asian creators to pitch, to get published, and to have a foot in the door, build a media resume, and pierce through the industry at large eventually. One article is not going to do it, and one organization is also not going to cut it. So while I talk about media and representation, I must also acknowledge what kind of stories we want to publish and what kind of stories must be told. As settlers, I think it's really important for South Asians to be allied to the indigenous peoples of this country. And it's crucial for us to amplify the voices stories of Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi communities, the Muslim communities, or other caste and class oppressed peoples of South Asia, to dismantle the imbalance with a broader feminist lens. It's 2021, and it's not the time to still remain transphobic or deny someone's gender freedom to self-identify. So coming back to the role of media during COVID, South Asian today is running on no capital, for example, running on volunteers who want to push for a more inclusive and equal world through powerful storytelling, which in itself is a huge amount of burden and in itself speaks volumes on the lack of support women have in media to create these spaces. We achieve an equal future while we are locked in our houses by connecting on fundamental issues through multimedia ways like reading or podcasts or videos. And not only does listening to diverse peoples changes or evolves our mindsets, it carries with itself the power of rebuilding regressive fabrics of the society. I'll probably just end with the fact that while Women's Day is fantastic and it's great and it's needed, it's important to remember that every day is Women's Day, that every day women and other gender oppressed peoples are fighting for equal rights. And it's crucial to understand that only a constant and ongoing amount of work or activism can help us embrace a more equal future. COVID is an uncertain, scary reality, and a lot of people are paying the brunt of still being underrepresented, and especially women. So it's about time to occupy this space and start telling our stories on our own terms. So I'll urge everyone listening here to support more women-owned and led businesses, to lend a ear, and to not make it just a woman's job to change the world. Even though we do the best job at it, it shouldn't just be our responsibility. So that's me. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, I don't know how the audience feels, but what a fabulous panel. I almost forgot to take important questions and kind of like sound smart as the moderator to ask you smart questions, because I'm completely floored. And one of the themes very quickly that I find being brought together, and I'm so glad this is happening, is because I'll confess, right? When I was given this chance as the Australia-India Institute Senior Research Associate to moderate this panel, I looked at the wonderful theme, and it had to do with success, and it had to do with leadership, women leadership. And I'm first generation. My parents didn't go to university, and I was always quite uncomfortable about the idea of success and leadership, because I'm as grassroots and as grassroots can get when it comes to coming up, you know, in terms of my law background, in terms of being a human rights activist from a tribal community, first generation in India. And so I had to do a lot of soul searching to be a moderator on a panel like this. But one of the themes that's come true across all the four of you has been the term community. Chon's wonderful story about her grandmother who made her grandfather promise about education, Dilpreet's story about telling underrepresented stories and the idea for us to come together, and Dr. Karen's quite amazing presentation of grassroots and kind of like bottom-up leadership and why that is important. And I'm very glad to emphasize that with these notes, I can perhaps ask the audience to post questions. Audience, come on, bring your questions, please post it. Otherwise, as the moderator, I'm going to jump in with many questions that I have for this wonderful panel that we have. So please come on board and interact with our panelists. As we wait for questions, perhaps Indira, if I can come to you with the first question and give you this very small, maybe just, you know, what you think about. You have the tag of being the community insider for the India Sun, and you bring in quite very amazing community focused stories from the Indian diaspora, which are very diverse. That of a tram driver, and, you know, that of a restaurant, let's say server, and you have quite an eye to actually configure and tell us, define what is a community right here in Australia. And so how has been your experience?
Okay, I think I'm in Australia now at the right time, because as the diaspora grows, there are plenty of stories coming out. And, there are thousands of stories waiting to be told. I've met so many interesting people. I've had so many inspirational stories to tell. For instance, I remember meeting this 70-year-old man who came to Australia via Delhi, via Afghanistan, via Greece, and landed on the shores of Sydney, because he came, via this illegally on a boat, on a ship. And then while working as a food picker 4 or 5 years later, the Australia government lifted its white policy. And then he became a permanent resident. And then he went on to become a very successful businessman. So and these are journeys that are so interesting to share. And this guy, remember him telling me that when he, then landed in Australia, he was one of the few Punjabi Sikhs in one of these country regions. But then people started interacting with them and playing cricket, and that's how his assimilation into the country began. And similarly, from second generation stories are also very interesting, in the sense that these are people who are caught in between two cultures. Their parents carry the cultural baggage from India. They're trying to adapt to both Western and Indian values. So there are hundreds and hundreds of stories, and I think I'm really happy to be here, because my resources are quite big, in the sense that you go to a country town, you go to the heart of the city, you'll always find there are plenty of stories waiting to be told. So it's been a really interesting experience.
Thank you so much. Dr. Karen, can I come to you with this very, I think, amazing presentation that you did? And I come from India myself, and I know for a fact that the two issues that you have been working on for the past 25 years, mental health in rural India, which is a big issue, and also to do with disability. I know that we had really short time, maybe around 7 minutes for presentation. Can you take some more time to tell us about the work that with them, with the organization in India? What are the ways? Thank you.
We've been working a lot on ways to support women who have mental distress without kind of increasing social exclusion and stigma. So if you say, mansik rogi ho, or we use words that are quite pejorative, that really makes things worse. And so one of the things we've been doing is building up awareness in communities that mental distress isn't a shameful thing. It's a way of our bodies and our minds just saying we need to look after ourselves a bit. One of the most effective ways we've found is forming psychosocial support groups. So we've been doing a lot of work in groups, and it was really great to hear Dilpreet referring to caste, which we know is a really negative hierarchy. And so we've been forming psychosocial support groups, which are got people from lots of different backgrounds. They're diverse, both education, class, and caste, trying to cross a lot of those barriers, but women who are living in the same area. And we follow through a curriculum called Naumid, New Hope, and we've had really, really great examples of women saying, look, I know that you're having a tough time. Can I take your kids to school? Or, talking about what is it like to be, Dalit, and how does that affect your life? And I didn't realize that, and, having quite open conversations. And so finding that groups can provide a safe social space, and also can allow formation of peer friendships, which can cross traditional boundaries. It's not all straightforward. We've had some things that didn't go so well, and then we've tried to talk about it. But we've had some, I think we particularly found it great to do these sort of provide a safe social spaces. And then women tend to feel free to take collective action and to kind of push back on some of the patriarchy and hierarchies that have kept them unable to speak up. So there's lots more, but those are a couple of things.
Thank you so much. I think I'll come to the third speaker as we wait for questions to come, and I'm sure Simone is helping us collect the questions. My lovely colleague Simon from the Australia India Institute. So Chon, I'm going to actually kind of repeat the wise words of wisdom you gave us. As you ended your wonderful sharing, you said that we are all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And quite true, I think, given that this is a global pandemic we're going through, and in your wisdom, you give us this. There are three important themes that you need to grapple with, fight through and overcome. And I want to actually kind of like stay with the theme of inclusivity and belonging that you give us. I'm very impressed that you are, heading really as a general manager and also the vice president at SAP, which has over, I think, close to 100,000 employees around the world. And that's quite an achievement, I would say. As a leader in your organization, how are you all working or thinking about belonging and inclusivity? And you come from a very strong indigenous, I think, culture, the Naga culture. How do you draw on both your indigenous wisdom and now as a leader in the corporate sector and look forward to a shared future?
Yeah, no, great question, Dolly. Thank you. And thank you for the kind words as well. I think coming from a close-knit community like ours, the Naga community has definitely helped in my corporate life as well, because thankfully speaking, and thanks to all of the great work done by women and organizations for generations and generations, diversity and inclusivity is now, a natural thing. It's top of the agenda for all of the big corporations as well, right? So, sometimes it's easy for us to feel despondent with the lack of speed and the inertia that sometimes we see with closing the gender gap. But just having diversity and inclusion as top of the agenda is one example of the work that everyone has done and that the difference that everyone can make in such an important matter. So, inclusion and sense of belonging for a very long time in my leadership roles, as I go for interviews for new roles and as I present my, my strategy for the coming years to my team, sense of belonging is one that's really high up in the agenda. It makes people obviously motivated. There's lots of studies done around psychological studies done around the importance of it. From a business standpoint as well, it's good for the business to ensure that people have a sense of belonging, right? So a couple of things that, well, there's a lot of things that organizations are doing in terms of creating more belongingness, particularly because we are in this theme. I'm going to talk about women in general, right? Having strong role models in the organization to look up to is so key. It has been so important for me, and it was really awesome to hear Karen's point around how women lift women up, and that holds true at all levels of the of society. It certainly holds true in the corporate world as well. So having strong role models has been really important, and having women in leadership positions also very important for us to keep discrimination and just our own biases in check as well. I say this to my team too. I don't think anyone goes out there with the intent of hurting people or bringing people down. But we do have biases that we need to always keep in check. So my organization, for one, has been doing a lot of enablement and trainings for men and women to be more aware of our own biases. And another really important note is around psychological safety, for people to feel safe to speak their mind and to talk, for people to know that they will not be belittled while sharing an opinion, right? And I'm very fortunate to work in a very diverse region like Asia Pacific and Japan and Greater China, unlike North America, where it's one massive country, or Canada and the US, I count them as very similar. Here we have lots of cultures in Asia, and lots of diversity, and it really allows us to build our leadership skills and to practice everything that we're learning at work as well. So Dolly, I suppose those are some of the things that in the corporate world we're doing to create that sense of belonging.
Thanks, Chon. Thank you so much. Dilpreet, as the moderator, I'm really impressed about, I think, South Asian today, and you have been nominated for some amazing prizes in terms of leadership, and your organization and what you're doing within even the state of Victoria and across. And it's amazing that, as like you say, from Punjab, right? And like you put it, a Punjabi feminist at heart and soul, you have a vision of South Asia, which is so important, both not only in terms of political, but also a feminist and a non-binary vision. And you talk about an equal future and how to kind of bring it together. Maybe to provoke you a little bit, the idea of South Asia is almost kind of a small pocket because India is so big, right? It kind of like becomes an appendix of India. How is it that in your leadership skill and your vision, looking at a feminist and non-binary future, do you envision perhaps giving an equal story and an equal visibility to all other South Asian communities? As somebody from Punjab and really a Punjabi feminist, come on, bring it on.
That's a great question, because I think I always say that usually South Asian spaces are just Indian spaces, and most often they're North Indian spaces, right? So it's a very progressive thing for people to say, oh, I said South Asia, so now I'm safe because I'm woke. But this has no, substance actually. And it's so true that in the West, South Asian spaces are dominated by North Indians, and more so by Punjabi diaspora. So as someone who's running a South Asian space, it's really so important for me to make sure that the stories that we are accepting or publishing do actually, cross borders and do actually come out of this Delhi being the capital of South Asia. So it could, it could involve publishing stories about feminism in Bangladesh, for example, or I talked to this wonderful Afghani journalist in the UK, and she's the founder of the first Afghan magazine, print and digital. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. That's one thing, like a lot of people don't even consider Afghanistan as a part of South Asia, right? So I think it's, like I said, it's an ongoing process. And of course, I have to keep myself in check. And even though looking at representation in quantitative measures can be annoying, and it can be, can be looked at as tokenistic, I think that's also a great argument, but it also does help keep you in check. So if every week I go back to South Asian Today and I see that all 7 stories are talking about India, are talking about only what's happening in, Delhi, then of course there's a problem, right? Because then the space is not equal. So I do have to keep myself in check. And I personally do go out of my way to connect with community members who are indigenous peoples of Pakistan, or, like I said, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi communities of South Asia. And I think it's absolutely impossible for South Asian spaces to do the work without actually being or holding a vision of South Asia. So we really need to come out of this Indian hegemony complex, and it's a huge amount of work. And I think it's going to take us years, but I do believe that the work has started, and I connect with a lot of people who are actually, are actually publishing the stories that are not just India focused. So I'm trying.
Very well answered. And I think there's a question for Chon, but just to add to what Dilpreet was saying, in the Indian subcontinent, there were 2 frontiers. One was the Northwest Frontier Province, and the second one was the Northeast Frontier Province. So in a sense, for us, I think for Dilpreet to be from the Punjab, we have to talk about the undivided history as well in terms of the process of decolonization and violence. And it's the same in the northeastern region of India. And today, as Myanmar is going through a coup, you can see hundreds of people and families along the international borders trying to enter the northeastern kind of borders and the boundaries right there. So I think it continues in a sense to give us an accountability in terms of storytelling and what is South Asia today. Chon, the time is yours. You have an amazing question. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. It's a very good question, and it's a lot in this question as well. So let me first answer the first part, which is leadership position can be quite stressful. Do you experience a difference in the respect you get from your male and female subordinates? It's very interesting that organizations have done a very good job at enforcing organizational culture within the organization, and then there is the societal culture as well, right? So I'm fortunate enough to work for a company that has a very strong culture of inclusivity. So at work, with my colleagues, with my team, you know, while there might be some shade, I haven't really felt the difference in the respect that, or in the way that they deal with me because I'm a female. However, that said, I do work with a lot of others outside our organization, interacting with customers in different cultures, you know. So in Japan, for example, it's a very, very male-dominated culture. You know, in India, we see a lot of females in leadership position as well. But, you know, I have gone in, and I wouldn't name the customer or the client, but just to give you an example, I went in to meet a very high-level C executive at a very large organization at India, and no kidding you, his first sentence to me was, "Who are you? What do you do? What's your role? And why should I be meeting you?" You know, and if I were, you know, a Caucasian, middle-aged Caucasian, I don't think I'd ever get that question, right? So I do experience things like that. And I'm unfortunately still the only female or a minority in the boardroom in discussions, and that should certainly change. And I have gone into meetings with my male colleagues, you know, people who report to me, and customers have addressed their question to my male colleagues, and it was usually a very uncomfortable period for my male colleagues, because they would then direct all the questions back to me. So, you know, it certainly still exists. But, you know, I take it in my stride. We're certainly seeing a lot of improvements. Like I said, organizations across the board, you know, diversity inclusion is top of their agenda, and we're certainly seeing the needle move. Just about 12 years ago, I was part of a hiring panel and decision in Brazil, and the hiring manager, you know, we were looking at the list of candidates, and at that time, you know, you would disclose their age as well. He wouldn't entertain someone because she was of a childbearing age. You know, that will absolutely not happen now. It's, you know, absolutely not, right? So even in, you know, a decade or so, we're starting to see those changes, which is really good. Now, to answer the second question around, you know, female employees taking more leave because of what we discussed around females taking on more of the unpaid care responsibilities, I think we need to look at the short-term, the mid-term, and the long-term solutions as well, right? I think right now the short-term solution for us, and Indra puts that very well in the beginning, around the need to listen more. You know, and that applies to corporations as well. Right now, I'm seeing that more than ever, there is a huge need for empathetic leadership, for listening and understanding what people are going through. Again, if I take the example of Japan, people tend to normally live in smaller houses in Japan. And so having your kids and your spouses as well working with you in the same small space, it takes an additional toll than it would perhaps to someone in Australia or India or somewhere, right? So I think really understanding that and looking at the situation uniquely and understanding what the challenges are. From a mid to long-term perspective, we certainly need to look at things like affordable childcare and having more of that, particularly in Australia. Conversely speaking, I think my team and my colleagues and my friends in India have actually fared better, the working mothers in India, because of the communal society that we have, with mothers and aunties and sisters pitching in to help. Whereas in Australia, because of our atomized society, it has been harder for women, right? So looking at policies around, you know, women coming back to work after years of taking leave, ensuring that things like progression are not impacted. Those are real things that organizations are looking at, and we certainly need to continue to do more of that as well, to ensure that they're not impacted and the gap is not widened. So hopefully that answers your question.
Wow, thank you so much. What a wonderful panel. And I have two questions here about the Australia-India Institute and bringing in more diverse and Indigenous women's role here. Very good question from Dr. Rani. We are definitely going to pass these questions on to the director and make sure that they are part of our meeting here at the Australia-India Institute. From Neeraj, will the Australia-India Institute ever be headed by a woman? I definitely hope so. I'm with you. hopefully that the Australia India Institute will listen to it, that the advisory board of directors will listen to this. And even from this 1 hour discussion panel that we have had, it's amazing what women can do. Women leadership needs to be recognized. And thank you all for the questions that you all are putting up. This will be recorded, it will go online. And I think we will hope that many more discussions go about in terms of women leadership and their contribution. I'm running short of I'm running over time by 3 minutes, but I would really like to thank you all. To Chon, to Indira, to Dr. Karen, to Dilpreet. Thank you so much for bringing your heart, your soul, for, in a way, I think, offering generosity and honesty to this conversation. I think I can see a soul, and I can really see a living example of what we can all do together as collectives. All of us invoke families, friends, leaders from the grassroots, the communities that we work with. And I think that is the basis of what true leadership is, not in terms of the positions we hold, but the very meaning of life and how we describe our life to be lived in a collective setting, looking at social justice. So on behalf of the director and my wonderful colleagues at the Australia India Institute, happy Women's Day to you all once again. And I thank you all for joining us on this wonderful, beautiful day to reflect together of the celebrations and also the challenges. And I think with that, we come to an end of this celebration and this event. Thank you so much, panelists, and thank you to the audience. Bye.
Thanks, Dolly.
Thank you for having us, Dolly. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.